The wind came from the northwest that morning, dry and flat, carrying dust across the wheat stubble like it had somewhere to be. October 14th, 1953. Dodge City, Kansas. And on the dirt road that ran from the highway to the Hollis farm, a black car was moving slowly, deliberately, the way a car moves when the man inside it already knows how the day ends. Margaret Hollis stood on the porch and watched it come. She was 44 years old, wearing the same work dress she'd worn every Tuesday since Earl died, and her hands were gripping the porch railing hard enough that the wood pressed lines into her palms. She didn't let go. Somewhere behind her, the screen door opened and her boys came out. Danny, 17, and Bobby, 14, and she told them to go back inside without turning around. They didn't go. She knew they wouldn't. She stopped asking. The black car rolled to a stop at the edge of the yard. Arthur Clemens stepped out. Regional Director, First Federal Bank of Kansas. Silver hair, pressed suit, leather briefcase held in his left hand like it weighed nothing. He didn't hurry across the yard. Men like Clemens never hurried. Hurrying suggested uncertainty, and Clemens had no uncertainty today. He had the papers. 60 days of missed payments, documented to the cent. A foreclosure notice, filed and stamped. And a purchase agreement already signed between First Federal and a land consolidation company in Wichita. He just needed Margaret Hollis off the property, and the law was entirely on his side. The neighbouring ranchers had come without being called. That's how it works in small Kansas towns. Word moves faster than cars. 12, maybe 15 people standing at the edge of the yard. 2 women from the church. 3 farmhands from the Dawson property next door. All of them watching. None of them moving. Clemens reached the porch steps and opened his briefcase. And then someone in the crowd said it. Quietly, almost to themselves. He's here. Every head turned toward the highway. A truck. Coming fast. Dust rising behind it in a long, pale column against the October sky. For a moment, no one moved. But that moment didn't start there. To understand what was about to happen in that Kansas yard, what one man was willing to risk and why, you have to go back 9 years, to a train platform in Fort Riley, and a promise that Margaret Hollis had been keeping ever since. If this story already has your attention, hit that subscribe button right now, because what John Wayne carried in his jacket pocket that morning would change everything. Fort Riley, Kansas. February 3rd, 1944. Earl Hollis was 37 years old, standing on a train platform in his army uniform, and he was trying not to look at his wife's face, because if he looked at her face, he wasn't going to be able to get on the train. Margaret was 35. Danny was 6. Bobby was 3 years old and didn't fully understand what the uniform meant, only that his father kept picking him up and putting him down and picking him up again. The train was leaving at 7:15. Earl had 40 minutes. He didn't make speeches. That wasn't Earl. What he said, standing on that platform with the February wind cutting across the Kansas plain, was simple. You keep it running. I'll come home. Margaret nodded. That was the whole agreement. 9 words, and both of them knew what was underneath them. 9 years of building that farm from 80 acres to 240, of cattle and wheat and 2 good seasons followed by 1 bad one, of debt paid back and debt taken on again, of a life that was genuinely theirs in a way that very few things in this world actually belong to people. Earl Hollis died at Anzio on February 22nd, 1944. 19 days after the platform. He was one of 7,000 Americans killed in that campaign, and the telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning while Margaret was fixing the fence on the north pasture. She kept fixing the fence. Every banker in Dodge City told her to sell. Told her a woman alone with 2 small boys had no business running 240 acres of wheat and cattle in Ford County. Told her the sensible thing, the practical thing, the realistic thing. Margaret walked into First Federal Bank that spring, sat across from the loan officer, and borrowed enough to get through the first season. She paid it back by November. Borrowed again in 1945. Paid it back. By 1951, she had paid off half the original loan in a single payment, and the farm had produced the best wheat yield in Ford County 3 years running. Then 1952 arrived. Drought. The worst Ford County had seen in 4 decades. The wheat didn't come up. The cattle thinned. The hired hands left when the wages dried. Margaret spent her savings, borrowed against the farm, and waited for 1953. 1953 was worse. 2 failed harvests. 60 days behind on payments. And Arthur Clemens coming up the path with Earl's farm in a folder. What nobody standing in that yard understood yet was that 3 days earlier, Margaret Hollis had made a phone call. A long shot. A letter, actually. 4 handwritten pages sent to a man she had met once, briefly, at a rodeo benefit in Wichita in 1951. She hadn't asked him to save her. She wasn't built for that kind of asking. She had simply written down the facts and then written one question at the bottom of the last page. Do you know anyone who can help? John Wayne read the letter on a Tuesday morning at his home in Encino, California. He read it once straight through, then set it down on the kitchen table and looked out the window for a while. Then he picked it up and read it again. Margaret Hollis had written it in a straight, plain hand. No dramatics, no self-pity, no flourishes. Just the facts, in order. Earl. Ancio. 9 years. The drought. The 2 failed harvests. The 60 days. The foreclosure date. And at the bottom of the last page, that single question. He sat with it for a long time before he did anything else. Then he made 3 phone calls. The first was to his personal attorney, Tom Oakley, in Los Angeles. The second was to a contact at the Federal Agricultural Lending Board in Washington, a man named Harold Sims, deputy director, who Wayne had met at a war bonds function in 1949 and stayed loosely in touch with since. The third call was to the corporate headquarters of First Federal Bank of Kansas in Topeka. He didn't identify himself on that last call, just asked general questions about the bank's agricultural lending procedures. The woman on the other end answered politely and told him nothing useful, which was exactly what he expected. What Oakley and Sims told him over the course of that Tuesday afternoon was something Margaret Hollis had no way of knowing. Federal regulations passed in 1951, the Agricultural Fair Lending Act, required any bank holding federal deposit insurance to offer drought-affected farm borrowers a formal hardship review before initiating foreclosure proceedings. It was not optional. It was not discretionary. It was the law. And Arthur Clemens, regional director of First Federal Bank of Kansas, had skipped it entirely. Not by accident. Sims knew why. First Federal had already negotiated a sale of the Hollis property to a land consolidation company out of Wichita called Meridian Land Group, $14,000 over assessed value. The deal was signed. Clemens just needed the farm empty, and he had moved to foreclose before Margaret could learn she had the right to demand a review. Wayne sat with that for a long time too. He understood exactly what Clemens had done. He understood that a phone call, even from him, would give Clemens time to find a workaround before the foreclosure date. A threat from a distance could be managed, delayed, buried in legal procedure until Margaret had no options left. So Wayne didn't call. He drove to the airport, bought a ticket to Wichita, rented a truck, and drove south toward Dodge City without telling anyone he was coming. He arrived before dawn on October 14th and waited for the black car. If you want to know what he had in his jacket pocket when he stepped out of that truck, stay with us. Because that's where everything turned. Wayne stepped out of the truck, and the crowd went still. Not starstruck still. Something deeper and quieter than that. The kind of stillness that settles over a place when the situation shifts and every person present feels it in their chest before their mind catches up. He walked across the yard at the same measured pace he walked everywhere. No hurry, no performance, boots hitting dry October earth with the steady rhythm of a man who had already decided what he was going to do and was simply doing it now. Clemens turned from the porch and saw him coming. His expression moved through 3 stages in about 4 seconds. Confusion, recognition, and then something tighter and more careful that wasn't quite either of those things. Wayne reached the bottom of the porch steps. He looked at Margaret, just for a moment, just long enough to tell her something without words. Then he turned to Clemens. "You Arthur Clemens?" "I am. Regional Director, First Federal Bank of Kansas." "That's correct." Clemens's voice was controlled, professional. The voice of a man who handled difficult situations regularly and considered this one no different. "Mr. Wayne, I'm not sure what brings you out here, but this is a private banking matter, and I can assure you all proper procedures have been—" Wayne reached into his jacket and produced a folded document. Tom Oakley had prepared it on the flight from Los Angeles. 4 pages. A formal legal letter citing Section 4, Paragraph 12 of the Agricultural Fair Lending Act of 1951, documenting First Federal's federal deposit insurance status, its legal obligations to drought-affected borrowers, and its failure to offer Margaret Hollis a mandatory hardship review before initiating foreclosure. Signed, notarized, and attached to a second page that outlined in precise and specific language the details of First Federal's existing purchase agreement with Meridian Land Group of Wichita. Wayne held it out. Clemens took it. The crowd couldn't hear the words, but they could see Clemens's hands. He read the first paragraph. The second. His face didn't collapse. Clemens was too controlled for that. But the color shifted. The certainty that had walked him up that path began to quietly drain, the way water drains from a cracked basin. Slow and irreversible. "This is a private banking matter," Clemens said again, more carefully this time. "You have no legal standing here." Wayne nodded once. "You're right. I don't." A pause that lasted exactly long enough. "But the Federal Agricultural Lending Board does. And I spoke with Deputy Director Harold Sims in Washington yesterday morning. He knows your name, Mr. Clemens. He knows Meridian's name. And he is very interested in how this particular foreclosure was processed." The silence that followed was the loudest thing that had happened on that farm in 9 years. Clemens closed the document, opened his briefcase, appeared to study something inside it. Everyone watching knew it was a stall. Wayne let it sit. He had learned something from 20 years in front of cameras and 20 years watching John Ford work. Let the silence breathe. Don't fill it. Let the other man fill it and watch what he reaches for. Clemens filled the silence with retreat. 40 seconds. That was how long it took. 40 seconds of staring into his open briefcase while 15 people stood in a Kansas yard and waited. And then Arthur Clemens straightened his jacket and spoke in the careful tone of a man recalculating every variable simultaneously. The bank would be willing to schedule a formal hardship review. Wayne looked at him steadily. When? We could arrange to schedule it within... When? 30 days. The foreclosure notice is withdrawn pending that review. It wasn't a question. It sat in the October air between them like something load-bearing, and Clemens looked at it and understood it was not moving, regardless of what he said next. He nodded once, took out the foreclosure papers, made a notation in blue ink across the top, and placed them back inside. Clicked the case shut. Walked back down the path to his black car with the same unhurried pace he'd used coming up it, except that something essential had gone out of it. Got in. Drove away until the dust settled and the engine faded, and there was nothing left of Arthur Clemens but 2 tire tracks in the dry October earth. The farm went quiet. Bobby Hollis, 14 years old, still standing on the porch where his mother had told him twice to go inside, said something so softly only the people nearest him heard it. He's gone. Margaret sat down on the porch steps. Not dramatically. She just sat down, the way a person sits when a weight they have carried so long they forgot it was there finally has somewhere to land. One of the churchwomen came forward and took her hand and held it without saying anything. That was enough. Before Wayne left, he wrote a name on a piece of paper and gave it to her. A lawyer in Wichita. Robert Delaney. Contingency cases only. Margaret looked at the paper, then at Wayne. Why did you come? You could have made phone calls. Wayne was quiet for a moment. Phone calls, he said, don't turn a man pale. If this story's moving you, hit that like button right now and subscribe so you never miss the ones that never made the headlines. The Hollis farm survived. The hardship review was scheduled for November 14th, 1953. Margaret retained Robert Delaney exactly as Wayne had suggested. Delaney walked into that review with Oakley's legal letter, the documentation of the Meridian Land Group Agreement, and a formal complaint filed with the Federal Agricultural Lending Board in Washington. The review board found that First Federal had materially failed to follow Federal Agricultural Lending Protocol. The foreclosure was permanently withdrawn. The loan was restructured, monthly payments reduced by 40%, spread across a new 10-year term that accounted fully for both drought years. The Meridian Land Group deal dissolved quietly the following month. Nobody from First Federal ever publicly acknowledged it had existed. Arthur Clemens was reassigned to a regional branch office in Nebraska in the spring of 1954. The bank cited internal restructuring. In Dodge City, they knew exactly what the restructuring was. The 1954 harvest broke the drought cycle. Wheat prices recovered across Ford County, and Margaret's reduced payments became manageable inside a single good season. By 1957, she was current on the loan. By 1961, she paid it off entirely, every cent, 9 years ahead of the restructured schedule. The same way she'd always done things. Quietly. Completely. Without making a story of it. Danny Hollis took over the farm in 1968. He ran it until 1994. All 240 acres. The same land Earl had borrowed against, that Margaret had held through widowhood and drought, and a banker who thought he had already won. It stayed in the Hollis family for another 4 decades after that October morning. In 1979, A journalist writing a piece on John Wayne's private life drove out to the farm and sat in Margaret's kitchen and asked her what she remembered most about the day. She didn't hesitate. "The moment after the car left," she said. "The way the farm went quiet. The way Bobby said, 'He's gone.' The way I sat down and, for the first time in 2 years, I couldn't feel the weight anymore." She looked out the kitchen window at the wheat field Earl had planted the spring before Fort Riley. "That's what he gave me. Not the farm. The farm was always mine." He just reminded the banker of that. John Wayne made 179 films. He won an Academy Award. He became the most recognizable face in American cinema for 3 consecutive decades. His name meant something that went beyond movies. It meant a particular kind of man, a particular way of standing in the world, unbothered by what standing that way might cost. None of that is what drove him to a Kansas farm on an October morning in 1953. What drove him was a 4-page letter written in a straight, plain hand by a woman who had kept a 9-word promise to a dead man for 9 years and was about to lose everything because a banker had found a legal shortcut and assumed nobody was watching. That was enough. The Hollis story was never publicized during Wayne's lifetime. He never mentioned it in interviews, never used it as a story about himself, never let it become part of the legend. It surfaced only in 1979 in a small regional magazine piece that most of the country never read. No cameras, no reporters, no audience except 15 people standing in a Kansas yard on a dry October morning. But those 15 people carried it. The ranchers, the church women, Danny and Bobby Hollis on the porch, where their mother had told them twice to go inside. They knew what they had witnessed. A man who had every reason to stay in California, make a phone call, and consider his obligation fully discharged. Instead, he drove to Kansas, because phone calls don't turn a man pale. That's the difference between obligation and character. Obligation stops at the minimum. Character drives to Kansas. They don't make men like John Wayne anymore. But every once in a while, a story like this one reminds you that men like him existed, and that the way they lived still matters. If this story moved you, leave a like and subscribe so we can keep telling the stories that never made the headlines.